they were striking into the median nerve, which is the largest nerve going to your hand. And if you can picture sort of banging your elbow on the wall or something, that hurts. Now think of taking some pliers, squeezing that nerve and then twisting it. Now think of that going on for hours on end. And that's the kind of pain it had been in. Now this pain was so ridiculous they had to invent a new word, excruciating, literally meaning out of the cross. And if you just use some simple maths, you'd have ended up with some shoulder dislocations as well on both sides because of the weight of his body. The way Jesus that would have died would have been by suffocation. He basically, because of the way he'd have been hung up, would have been in an inhaled position. So for him to breathe out, he'd need to push up with his feet on the nails that would have been in his feet. Now he'd have also been pushing up against some coarse wood behind him. And that would have caused quite a lot of pain. And the way he'd have died would have been from exhaustion when he wouldn't be able to do that anymore. The carbon dioxide in his blood would have made it acidic, and it would have made his heart beat irregularly. And so he'd have known at the time when he was going to die that his heart was beating irregularly. He'd have been able to say, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." He'd have known when he was about to die. Now, because of the fact that he would have been losing so much blood, he'd have entered into heart failure. He'd have had fluid around his lungs and fluid around his heart. And when they'd have pierced his side, the fluid that you hear which came out, which is water and blood, would have been from the fluid around his lungs and his heart, as well as the blood from his heart. And it would have been impossible for him to survive. The people who killed him were actually soldiers. They may not have been medics, but the job of a soldier is to know how to kill people. These were not mere people who just don't know what to do when they want to kill somebody. If they didn't manage to do it, they themselves would have been in danger of being killed. And had he somehow, hypothetically survived looking pitiful, he could not have inspired his disciples to start a worldwide movement, now could he? Thank you.
Okay, so there'll be 10 minutes of questions between the two sides. To do one question from opposition, then one question from opposition to each other, and you get a chance to respond, I believe. Yeah. I don't mind. It's up to you. Stand up, please.
Okay. And you all hear me?
Yeah.
Right. St. Matthew says, by the way, the Gospels were anonymous, the names are added later. Shows how man-made it is, by the way. St. Matthew says the keepers died of fear when encountering the angel of the Lord. I have two questions about this. One, did you think it happened? And two, do you think this is a moral proposition to have? Love thine enemies. Yours.
Sorry, I didn't hear your question.
Okay. Okay. St. Matthew says that the keepers of the tomb, when the angel came down from above, as we all know he did, the keepers died on encountering the angel. Now, I have two questions. Do you think that, one, this happened, and two, if it did happen, how will you reconcile this with your belief that loving thine enemies?
I've got Matthew, where's that reference from? You said
Oh, believe me, it's in Matthew.
Well, I know my Matthew, that's why I was a bit...
Yeah, it's in the resurrection. But when the angel comes down... Okay, when the angel comes down, the keepers die.
Okay, Phil, sit down.
When they encounter the angel.
If you don't want to answer that now, then you can get a chance to respond to that in your summation if you want to have a look at it in the 5-minute break that we have between the speaking and the question at the end.
Okay.
To save time because it's cold.
Right,
Do you want to
I'll
ask your
just very
question?
quickly respond to it very quickly. I don't know about this kind of keepers dying and stuff. All I know is, they did actually go back and report back to the Jewish council and said that, the body is missing. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to find out what actually happened. And when they went back to the Jewish authorities to say, the body's gone, they were told to then go and spread this rumor that Jesus had actually not died and that they'd, stolen his body. So this is something which, if you look at the Bible properly, it does say they went back.
I can quote from Matthew, they became as dead men.
Yeah.
They died. Lying their bed. Well, they died.
I'm sorry.
Okay, we have silence on the floor, please.
It's the same thing.
That's just a misread.
It's not a mystery.
That's what I'm saying.
We have silence from the floor, please.
That's the same thing. It's 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 the same thing.
it said, his appearance was like lightning and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. So,
Okay, can we have a question from the opposition, please?
Okay, you said that there's no non-Christian evidence of the resurrection. But how do you reconcile that with the fact that if it was admitting to the resurrection having happened, surely it would be Christian?
I'll happily answer that. Because if you know anything at all about him, it is entirely possible to be objective without automatically believing everything you read. I mean, you can write about someone dying and talking about, the followers of this prophet, of this priest, of this holy man, saying all the things they said without actually then, believing it and automatically converting to Christianity. So I think that quite easily answers your question.
But if they're agreeing that the resurrection happened, surely that would be very significant, and so they would become. I'm not talking about just the death, but the resurrection.
Yeah, but I mean,
and if the story is that he died and he came back to life, then surely they would then become Christians because it's pretty significant.
Yeah. Not everyone's quite as easily led as that.
Another question from the proposition, please.
So, I would just like to ask you to introduce one bit of objective, unbiased evidence at all to support your evidence.
So you want us to talk about people who are Christians?
I would just like to introduce one piece of objective, unbiased evidence.
Okay, right. I think one thing that you've heard from these guys is that there's no evidence outside of the Bible that there was a Jesus who basically lived, did miracles, and then he died and then came back to life, which is nonsense, really.
If you name one, please.
Okay, now I'll give you some names.
Go on.
Finish. There are people, for example, like Pliny the Younger, for which you can look at his writings. He was a Roman person who was from around about that time, who'd have been writing as a historian, who wasn't a Christian, who wasn't pro-Christianity at that time. This was something which was seen as an attack to the Roman government. They didn't want another king coming and purporting to be the king of kings, essentially taking, control over their own kingdom. There's Josephus, who's a Jewish person, who wasn't a Christian, who himself also wrote about Jesus' life, his death, and then the fact that there were people who had been reported to say that they'd seen him after his death. There's Tychicus, so you can write some notes and you can go and look them up on Google as well. These people do exist. There's Eusebius, you can look and find out about those people. Those are people from around about the time who you can look up and see whether or not they were Christians. And especially, there's another person, Strauss as well, who writes about him. Now, Strauss was actually an atheist. Strauss inspired Friedrich Nietzsche. This is the same guy who started writing writings about God, saying there is no God. Now, Nietzsche had actually been a Christian at the time. When you read about Strauss, his faith actually fell apart. And yet this same Strauss said that the whole opinion that Jesus had just merely fainted and not died, right, was utter nonsense, given the fact that the disciples were then inspired to go and essentially shake the world. So these are not people who are, Christians at all. This is people, these are people who've inspired other atheists to stop believing in Christianity.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm going to go to the next question. The opposition, it's their turn. Does the opposition want to ask a brief question, or can we give another question to the proposition? Yeah. If you're half-hearted, then
I suppose I can just give. I'm sorry. I can just give a general question. When you say overarching questions like this, it's overarching statements like there is no evidence for one thing, or there are no writings. Does that not mean that you have a whole knowledge of all the evidence there is in the world? Don't you need to have a knowledge of everything that goes on in the world to be able to say there's definitely no evidence for X or Y?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that very easy question. There was a Christian apologist called Douglas Kevitt who tried to compare the resurrection of Christ with the Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon. And there are a few points to make about this. The first is that the crossing of the Rubicon by Caesar was reported by Cicero, who was anti-Caesar. There are